General Motors has come out with some respectable cars, but also some awful ones. But that could be said for every other car company. Over the past couple months, I talked about the worst 80s cars from Ford, GM, and Chrysler. Now it's time to move on forward to the 90s. Of the big three, I would say GM typically gets more hate than the others. For me, like I said earlier, each manufacturer has both good and bad cars. There were a couple of factors that helped me make this list: the reliability, how well it sold, what the public thought of it at the time, and how well it holds up today. Lastly, if you happen to own one of these cars or know someone who does, just know I'm not here to make you feel bad in any way. This video is for entertainment purposes only. Based on the research I've done along with reading your comments, these 4 cars are some of GM's worst cars from the 90s. We begin with the Cadillac Catera. This car was an attempt at bringing a more luxurious version of a popular car across the pond. Essentially, it was an Opel Omega B. The idea was right. GM thought that since it was popular overseas, why not give it a shot in the States? And so Cadillac wanted to try again with the entry-level luxury segment. Many of you probably remember the Cimarron. That was one of the first attempts by GM to appeal to entry-level buyers. That car was just a Cavalier with a special grille. The intended demographic was younger people. When we think of Cadillac, especially during the 90s, most of the buyers were older or more mature. So GM got creative, you could say, and tried a couple of different marketing strategies. The sales brochure and commercials featured an all-new animated character named Ziggy, and the idea behind this was that this was the caddy that zigs, or is quick and nimble. To add, some of the commercials featured supermodel Cindy Crawford.
Once upon a time, there was a beautiful princess who wanted a little more magic in her life. So she went to see the wizard and asked him what to do. "Get a Catera," said the wizard. And suddenly there was a coach like she'd never seen before. Well, off they drove into the night with the beautiful princess at the reins. "This is magic," thought the princess, "but I don't know whether to buy it or lease it." "Well, either way, I'll just put it on my bill," said the wizard. Catera, it's the caddy that zigs.
After watching that commercial, you would agree that the idea is kind of weird. We have this supermodel and animated bird getting along together. The idea is similar to that of Blue's Clues, and their audience was children. Anyway, these weren't even quick, which is ironic. Under the hood was a 3-liter, good for 200 horsepower and 192 pound-feet of torque. 0 to 60 in 8.5 seconds. I'm not saying it's horrible, but you advertise this thing as being Ziggy, and it's not. For 1997, these started at $30,000, and the entry-level models had cloth seats. Most standard features that you would see on a car at this price range were added on options. I mean, paying extra for leather seats and a caddy is kinda outrageous. Although, if you were curious, the glove box was air-conditioned. Come 1998, that little character we began to fall so deeply in love with was killed off. By 2000, in an attempt to save the Catera, it underwent a few different styling changes, and while I feel like it looks better, sales numbers did not reflect that. On top of everything else, these were plagued with timing belt and water pump issues, which honestly could be catastrophic. So there you have it, the Cadillac Catera. Next is the 5th generation Monte Carlo. This was the second to last Monte Carlo in production and probably one of the most forgotten. The Monte was such a popular and respected car back in the day, especially those 4th generations introduced in '81. I mean, those G-bodies, man, were they something else. They're still so iconic in 2024, at least to me. And after such a good run, GM cut production in 1988. You know what they say, all good things must come to an end. After being gone for some time, the name was back, and that's kinda all that was back. Now it was a 2-door Lumina with front-wheel drive and no V8 option. Mind you, that is the first of the Carlos to feature these characteristics. Also, there were no longer those distinctive curves incorporated in the styling, it was all rounded off. As I said earlier, this was just a 2-door Lumina. It was Chevy's counterpart of the Regal, Cutlass Supreme, and Grand Prix coupes. And with these new Monte Carlos, there was no longer an SS trim. You had 2 options, either LS or Z34. I'm sure you can guess which was the sporty version and which was not. The Z34s came with red colored badging, front and lower air dam, blacked out trim instead of chrome. It came standard with bigger wheels. You had the option to add a spoiler, and of course, a bigger engine was under the hood. The regular LS models came with a 3.1 V6 good for 160 horsepower and 185 pound-feet of torque, whereas the Z34s had the 3.4 liter good for 215 horsepower and 215 torque. The last two model years came with Buick's 3800 series V6, and while those made less horsepower, they made it up with more torque, and you're also getting a much more reliable engine. I'll be honest, sales numbers weren't awful, but they were nowhere near as many as the prior generation. Truthfully, it's hard to top those G-bodies, so that doesn't seem all that fair. However, they sold worse than the last generation Monte Carlos. I feel as if I'm kinda on the bandwagon of hate for these. Well, first, I don't hate these cars at all. Seeing one in 2024 would be amazing, especially if it was a Z34. Additionally, having the Monte Carlo name and also being super popular in NASCAR, everyone expected these to pack a punch. If you see these from a different eye, meaning seeing them for more as a personal luxury coupe, then by all means, if I were in the market for a sports car or sports coupe, I'd take a Talon or Avenger, or honestly anything else. I also think the Lumina Z34s look better anyway. I'm sure many of you had this coming. What's a worse 90s car list without mentioning Geo? Geo was a sub-brand of GM from 1989 until 1997. The idea was to ask some Japanese automakers if they could help produce some captive imports to fit that void of not having these small, subcompact, fuel-efficient cars sold by a domestic automaker, kinda like the Aveo for more of a modern comparison. The Storm and Spectrum were based on Isuzu models, the Metro and Tracker were Suzuki based, and the Prism was Toyota based. The idea was similar to that of Ford, who asked Mazda to essentially do the same thing with the Festiva, even the Dodge Raider and Mitsubishi Montero. So captive imports weren't entirely a new concept, especially during the 90s. I feel like most of us know about Geo and how cheap the quality really was. The door and body panels were super thin. For some models, hubcaps were an optional extra. They were super slow, 0 to 60 was eventually. They weren't made all that well. They were super uncomfortable to drive, and being on the highway in one of these wasn't always the safest option. Nevertheless, you got what you paid for. I mean, new, these cars were $5,000 to $6,000. When we think Geo, most of us would immediately think of the Metro, even though the Prism, which was basically a Corolla, sold the most for the first couple of years. Two engine options were available for the Metro, the standard 1 liter, good for 53 horsepower, or the 4-cylinder, good for 70. Obviously, these are laughable numbers at the time and today, but in all honesty, these things were econoboxes to the max. I mean, to get 47 miles per gallon combined in a non-hybrid, that's pretty impressive. To keep the positive ball rolling, these Storm GSIs were pretty decent in terms of being that sporty option. Later models came with a 1.8 liter that made 140 horsepower made into a 5-speed manual, 0 to 60 in 7.2 seconds, which again isn't that bad. To add, the Tracker wasn't an off-road beast by any stretch of the imagination, but again, it wasn't horrible, especially for the price, and I believe it had 4-wheel drive. However, at the end of the day, you can't really sugarcoat this brand. They were sold alongside the Chevys at the time. They never really had their own dealership. And when was the last time you saw one? You know, they all fallen apart. I think from a 2024 perspective, they are starting to grow on me. If a low mile one popped up for sale, I would probably take a second look. The Buick Skylark was and still is respected by many, especially the second generation models. Let's fast forward to the 6th generation Skylark, and obviously it's a completely different car than it once was. Unlike the Monte Carlo mentioned before, I'm not mad that it's in the shadow of its older counterparts, but I'm not saying it looks or performs all that well either. This was the last generation of the Skylark and was produced from 1992 until 1998, utilizing GM's N-body platform, which was in its second iteration. On this platform were the Grand Am, Achieva, and of course the Skylark. It's kind of the same story with the Catera. The goal was to appeal to a younger audience. Not so much to be an entry-level car, but to show that Buick can be driven by teens and younger adults. To help this narrative, they offered a coupe model, because that means it is sporty or a sports car. On this N-body platform, Pontiac and Oldsmobile also had their coupe counterparts. But in all honesty, what GM said as being, quote, that new age styling, I think it's just too much. I would so much rather prefer the Olds or the Pontiac. I also found it interesting that they kept the trim option of Grand Sport. Back in the day, that meant a fire-breathing 455 V8, but now is a V6, which again is totally respectable. I'm going to make an entire video on this car. I don't want to go too much in depth on this package just yet. For the first couple of years, these Buicks had a lot of recycled parts from their prior N-body cars, mainly that 2.3 quad 4 and the 3.3 liter V6. To add, earlier models came with a 3-speed auto, while other automakers had a 4-speed. In all honesty, the sedans are fine to me. They too look strange, especially that beak in place of a front bumper, but I think the coupe was even more strange. This reminds me of what GM did back in the 70s with the Skyhawk. Basically, GM badge engineered all of their R-body cars onto every division but Cadillac, and they were a huge hit, but the Buick version sold terribly. Buick and Oldsmobile, at least in the 90s, had a very similar demographic, and I would think it would be one or the other in terms of selling a coupe model. I'm sure it cost GM next to nothing to change a few things here and there, but at the end of the day, these Skylark coupes in particular were not a sales hit. That is going to wrap it up for this week's video. I do sure hope you enjoyed. And again, I'm not trying to talk trash or diss anybody's cars or what they had or what they could afford. That's not what I'm here to do. This is just for entertainment purposes only. There won't be a poll for this week's video just because, like, I mean, how are you going to compare these? There also won't be a tier list just because I really can't make a tier list with these. Stay tuned for next week's video. We are going into the 80s. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do yet, either a list or a certain car. We'll just have to see. But with all that, I will see you guys next week.